the two most popular books on Christian nationalism. And by popular, I mean just immediate sales on Amazon right now are sadly not my own books. They are books advocating for Christian nationalism by name.
I'm Mitch.
And I'm Missy.
We're co-workers.
He's the boss, and we're married.
And she's the boss. Together, we host Good Faith Weekly, a podcast on faith and culture.
What could possibly go wrong?
Tune in and find out. Missy. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up, talk about the upcoming midterm election, and then later on the pod, Missy and I sat down with University of Oklahoma sociology professor Dr. Samuel Perry. He has a new book out, The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy. It's going to be a great pod, so stay tuned. Hello there, Missy. How are you?
Good. Cheers me.
Cheers.
Let's cheers for the microphone.
Ah, there we go.
That wasn't right.
That was a dunk.
Oh, okay. Clearly, I never did handbells in church. Congratulations. We made it out of TikTok jail.
We did. We are out of TikTok jail.
If you've been following along with our TikTok saga, Good Faith Media has been in TikTok jail for, I don't know, for a long time now. We actually didn't.
We don't really know why we were in TikTok jail.
We didn't get let out. We just kind of escaped and created a new profile.
Shh. Don't tell anyone.
Okay. Well, anyways.
But
so
we're out.
TikTok jail, so we are filming a little bit of video tonight. Mm-hmm. Maybe some of it will make it, and maybe our young, hip social media director will say, yeah, no. I don't know.
Yeah, put the 40 and 50-year-old folks on.
Anyways. So, hey.
Yes.
So, in other news, it's November.
It is November.
So, have you started?
The No Shave November?
No.
What's that?
Christmas music.
You know, I got in the dang car today to go get the mail from the post office, and I get hit with Christmas music. This is an incredible debate that happens not only in the Randall house, but in households all over the United States. I mean, forget Republican and Democrat, forget red and blue. This is the real debate going on in 2022. Is it okay to listen to Christmas music before we cut into the turkey and celebrate Thanksgiving?
Well, given the state of the world the last few years, I think we need a little bit of hope where we can get it. I think we'd be remiss not to mention the
attack on Paul
Pelosi, last week.
And
I don't know what to say
about
it.
Well, you know, Missy, this is exactly what we have been talking about for several years here at Good Faith Media, that rhetoric from elected officials and those in power is meaningful and purposeful, and it can go sideways in an instant. We saw that on January the 6th, and the rhetoric has not ceased, and the vilification of political opponents as enemies of America has infused this ideology and mentality in certain individuals across this country. And I am afraid that there's going to be more violence and more attacks on political candidates. And I don't care if it's a Republican or a Democrat. This is absurd, and it is evil and must be stamped out. It has no place in a sensible democracy. So come on, elected officials, come on, politicians who are running for office. Stop it with the vile rhetoric that you espouse, and let's find some common sense. And even after the attack, Missy, there were politicians and candidates who were poking fun at this attack. And it just breaks my heart and infuriates me at the same time.
I just can't imagine what it's like to be in public life right now. To be in public life and know that your family is vulnerable, or to be vulnerable yourself. I don't know.
Our prayers are with Paul Pelosi. It sounds like he's going to make a full recovery, and we celebrate that. And again, please, folks, condemn any violence towards our elected officials. We're so much better in this, but at times I'm afraid that we're not. So let's stand up against it, and let's continue to fight for that more perfect union, as Jefferson stated a long time ago.
Absolutely.
And speaking of that, you and I got to sit down this week with a fellow Normanite, Dr. Sam Perry from the University of Oklahoma. He's a sociologist, and he has a brand new book out, The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy. We've been talking a lot about Christian nationalism recently. We talked to theologians, political pundits, and we thought, you know what? Let's get a sociologist engaged in this conversation. So it's a great interview. I hope you enjoy it. So stay tuned.
Hey listeners, check us out online at goodfaithmedia.org and follow us on social at gfmedia.org. We'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. I'm new here and could really use the feedback, but only if it's glowing. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a guest just across the highway here in Norman, Oklahoma at the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Samuel Perry is among the nation's leading experts on conservative Christianity and American politics, race, sexuality, and families. Along with numerous articles published in leading academic journals, Dr. Perry has also authored or co-authored 4 books, including Growing God's Family, Addicted to Lust, Taking America Back for God, and his newest book, The Flag and the Cross. Dr. Perry, welcome back to Good Faith Weekly.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Always a pleasure.
Well, we're glad that you joined us today. Over the last couple of weeks, Dr. Perry, we have had numerous guests on the podcast talking about Christian nationalism. We've had theologians talking about it. We've had political pundits talking about it. And so when we, picked up your book, the Flag and the Cross, we thought, okay, now we need to hear from a sociologist because the content within the book was just outstanding. So let's begin there. With the midterms less than a week away, we want to talk to you today about the influence Christian nationalism is having upon this election. So as a sociologist, can you define Christian nationalism from your perspective?
Sure. And I actually think our definitions are not evolving, but expanding in some important ways to try to capture some of the nuance that we're actually seeing unfold as people respond to this concept of Christian nationalism in real time. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So in one sense, let's talk about Christian nationalism maybe as 3 things. And one of them is very old and the other 2 are relatively new. Christian nationalism, especially white Christian nationalism, we could define as a political ideology or a political theology. That is both part of a deep story about America's past and a vision for its future. It's an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a very particular kind of Christianity. When I say Christianity, of course, I don't mean somebody who has given their life over to Jesus. I mean more of Christianity as culture or Christianity as ethnoculture. The way America as we know it, our way of life, what my country and all of that implies. So that is very old. That is actually older than the country itself. As we talk about in the book, this idea that race and religion and national identity would be intermingled with one another, goes back to British, colonialists interacting with the Native Americans and as Christians, as British citizens, and as white people. And so white Christian nationalism, the idea that America is rightfully for people like us, is something that is very old and something that we try to measure in our various books. The 2 most recent developments, one is Christian nationalism could also increasingly be understood as an identity people are claiming. It is no longer, it used to be, this ideology or this political theology we would call Christian nationalism. People would either dismiss it or they would minimalize it and say, hey, that's not really a thing, or say that's kind of a slur. And we're now getting to the point where actually people are embracing that identity,
right? Yeah,
and arguing for it by name. Marjorie Taylor Greene is the most famous example, but you have others. And in fact, the two most popular books on Christian nationalism, and by popular I mean just immediate sales on Amazon right now, are sadly not my own books. They are books advocating for Christian nationalism by name. Yeah. So it is an identity, not just an ideology, but it is an identity where people are saying, I am a Christian nationalist. And there's maybe disagreement about what that implies, but they're at least owning the identity. And lastly, Christian nationalism could also increasingly be understood as a political strategy that aims to activate and mobilize people on the basis of that ideology and that identity. And that is also something rather new. Historically, you have Reagan, Obama, even George W. Bush, who leaned heavily on like evangelical rhetoric. Whenever they mentioned religion and politics, especially from national platforms, they never talked about it in terms of like culture warring, Christians versus seculars, or Christians versus everybody else, or the persecution of Christians, and how we need to take back our country for its Christian heritage and that kind of thing. That is actually really relatively novel to Sarah Palin and later Donald Trump, and subsequently all of the copycat Trumps like the Marjorie Taylor Greene and the Lauren Boeberts and the Doug Mastrianos and increasingly Josh Hawley and Ron DeSantis and others. So I think that's to sum up. I mean, I think you're looking at Christian nationalism as both a political ideology that drives people, also an identity that is probably even more active in terms of mobilizing Americans, but it is also a political strategy that far-right politicians can use to try to mobilize those audiences.
So, Dr. Perry, in a recent Pew Research poll, 4 out of 10 Americans said they believe that the U.S. should be a Christian nation. And this is obviously, as you've alluded to, coming up more and more on the campaign trail. Can you kind of go back and unpack a little bit? I have my own theory, but I'm guessing our listeners might appreciate your more academic and maybe appropriate theory of what is the root cause of this movement of Christian nationalism? Where did it come from? How did we get here?
After Dr. Perry's astute answer, we really want to hear yours.
I'll refrain. I want to keep my job.
So evidence suggests that Christian nationalism responds to perceptions of threat. There was actually a really interesting recent study by 2 social psychologists and their team, Rosemary Alkire and Mikey Pasek. And what they did is they did this experiment where they exposed Christians to different kinds of conditions. And one of those conditions was to tell them that their numbers were declining, that they were going to be a religious minority by 2050. And they found that when you told Christians about their impending minority status, they responded with greater Christian nationalism and Trump support. And that makes perfect sense because Christian nationalist ideology and Trump support are likely a response to perceptions of threat, that our numbers, our political and cultural influence are declining, and that our power is going to be taken away, and we need to circle the wagons to make sure that we don't lose that cultural and political power, and we define who is really American, who is truly American, who is America for. And so I think why are we seeing this this kind of rhetoric and this kind of ideology emerge now in the political cycle is because that kind of rhetoric can activate anxiety and fear among Christian populations to make them mobilized to say, oh, wow, I really need to vote because America as we know it is being taken away. And if we lose power, then that's it. We're never going to get it back. And so I think this is a strategic time for leaders on the far right to be able to leverage that kind of cultural and political anxiety. Now, there's also another story, a part of this story, and I think increasing secularization is part of this story. And what I mean by that is secularization can mean a variety of different things. People are going to church less, or that maybe more and more Americans are identifying as unaffiliated rather than with their traditional something that they would have identified with 30 years ago, like being a Christian. But increasingly, secularization can also mean that religious identities are no longer our most important social identities, and they don't organize all of our other identities. So what has taken place within the last few decades is that political and partisan identities, ideological identity, whether I'm conservative, whether I'm liberal, whether I'm Republican, whether I'm Democrat, these have become more important identities, and these are now organizing the religious identities to where What I really care about is I care about my ideological and political tribe holding power. And religion in that situation becomes leveraged and useful as a way to organize and to say, this is us, that is them. Here's what we believe, here's what they believe. And so religion is just one among many identities that are now organized under these partisan and ideological identities. And that means if you identify as a Christian, but I disagree with you politically, I am probably going to question whether or not you are truly a Christian in my sense of the word, right? Because what really matters is whether you identify with me politically and ideologically, not whether we are both baptized, whether we affirm the same doctrinal creeds, all those kinds of things.
Dr. Perry knows this as well. I mean, a lot of people of faith have forgotten their own history. You and I are Baptist, and Baptists have certainly forgotten what happened to them in the 17th century when they came over to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and were persecuted. So we've forgotten those stories, or we've chosen to ignore them. So we hear exactly what you're saying, Dr. Perry. Thank you so much. Now, in preparation for this interview, Missy and I both read your most excellent book, The Flag and the Cross. And in part of the book, you describe, you and your co-author provided these 7 questions that I'm going to call markers. If that's misstating it, I apologize. But kind of 7 different markers for Christian nationalism, or some statements that they would agree with strongly in your questionnaire. One of those markers is their belief that they are doing the very will of God. Now, you mentioned earlier in the interview, is Christian nationalism a political movement, or is it a theological movement, or is it both? This is where it gets really frightening for me, Dr. Perry, because yes, I think it's a political movement, but it's so rooted in this idea of certainty, of theological certainty, and the policies that they are trying to advocate for are really terrifying if you peel that onion enough. So why is this understanding of political practice in doing the will of God so dangerous when it comes to Christian nationalism?
Well, I think once you are able to eliminate dissenting voices, and this is the climate that we find ourselves in, where we are polarized, and if we are a unified group on the right or the left, part of that unification involves quieting, moderating voices and dissenting voices, and so what you end up with is a bunch of people who are very, very convinced that only they are right. This is a problem on both the right and the left, certainly, and so I don't mean to both sides this kind of thing. Asymmetric polarization is in fact what we're witnessing, whereas in terms of like what we call affective polarization, I mean, it's probably fair to say the left and the right equally don't like each other, or they equally distrust one another. But in terms of who has proactively done more work to try to violate democratic norms or to play constitutional hardball, it has been the right as of late, especially with the very, very angry rhetoric that you can see coming from, I think, campaigners right now. This idea that, being theologically convinced that you alone have the truth and that everybody else is your enemy, I think it elevates and escalates, the potential for violence and for really an unwillingness to compromise in any way. Because really, once you are convinced that your side is on the side of God, to even suggest that we would compromise is like saying, well, maybe we should just compromise with Satan on this one, guys. Like maybe we should do the less biblical thing, or the less Christ-like thing. Maybe we should do the more demonic thing, or Luciferian. That's the popular term now. Maybe we should engage with the Luciferian left on this issue. That sounds unconscionable, of course. And so the more that you believe that you alone are on the side of God, and you're unwilling to acknowledge that anybody else has some insight, and that makes compromise impossible. Now, combine that with what we're seeing now is political scientist Paul Jupe has done some fascinating work on this, and I reference his efforts all the time, or his research. He has shown, and he's bounced these numbers around Twitter a little bit, he's shown that when you combine Christian nationalist ideology with belief in a good versus evil kind of spiritual war, the spiritual warfare language, and Satan and demons and angels, and how we feel a part of this kind of thing, you see an increased acceptance of or a toleration toward political violence. And that makes perfect sense, because with Christian nationalism, you have the belief that something has been taken away from you or is being taken away from you. And with this kind of eschatological vision, you get the cosmic stakes that are eternal. And this idea that it is, if we lose, it's not just our political team losing, it is God losing. It is, as Roger Stone says, it is plunging America into 1,000 years of darkness. This is angels and demons, and that creates that makes democracy impossible. That makes compromise impossible. Makes cooperation. Only victory is the option, or some kind of massive sacrifice or death, going to jail. And sometimes that is justified, right? So, like during the civil rights movement, I hope people on the side of civil rights were convinced of the righteousness of their cause, and their willingness to go to jail. And yet, I think the consequence of misinformation and a lot of, really charged rhetoric on the right has led a bunch of very scared white Christians to feel like they are the good guys in this new civil rights battle, and they're willing to do anything.
Thank you.
Dr. Perry, another strategy we've talked about the last, as Mitch mentioned several of our other interviewees, we've asked everyone, and I think in part because Mitch and I are looking for the answer as well. But you talk about in the book how Christian nationalists will take familiar terms and redefine them or code them for their purposes, and then of course creating dog whistles and all of that you talk about. But like things such as religious liberty or church state separation, and just the taking and the co-opting of these terms, and we're constantly asking, how do we combat this practice? What do we do? How can we, I don't know, fix it, Jesus?
Did you just call Sam Jesus?
Yeah. I think that is one of the challenges that we're facing now, is and something we have actually imported into our nation from other nations, is the strategic use of misinformation and disinformation to not just lie about the people we don't like, but to create a kind of a nihilism of why bother, why even engage with all of this stuff. It's just lies anyway, to make you really kind of hopeless about getting truth, and ultimately just appealing back to power. And so, like with the flexibility of these words, like religious liberty, which is just a great example of that. Religious liberty, of course, doesn't mean religious liberty for others. It means religious liberty for us. It's religious liberty in the Massachusetts Bay Colony sense. That is, it is our religious liberty to arrange a society as we see fit. Or I think, in the book we argue that the word Christian in political circles is also leveraged as a dog whistle, and that makes more sense when one political party is more aligned and more comprised of white Christians. Saying to that group of people, hey, Christians are under attack, is basically the same thing as saying our people, conservatives, are under attack, Republicans are under attack. And so the language becomes changed, even the language of Christian nationalism now. So like when people are identifying as Christian nationalists, they very rarely think that, we are trying to take the country back to oppress those people who are wrong. They try to redefine that as Christian patriotism, which we don't believe is the same thing. Or they try to redefine that as, we just want to vote our values. We're just conservative Christians who are trying to vote our values. So we're Christian nationalists, which is also not what we believe. But to redefine those terms, it makes Christian nationalism seem either innocuous and benign, or it makes it seem like, oh, the left they're the ones who have the problem with Christians voting their values, and they're the ones who have patriotism, which is, again, not what we argue. So how do we combat that? I think it is. I mean, gosh, I wish I had better answers, but I think it requires us. It requires us as these concepts become more popular. For example, Christian nationalism, as people are talking about it more and more. I think it is our responsibility as people who think that the phrase means something, and we'd like to think that it's describing something negative, to be very careful about how we define that, so that it is not basically the left's version of the word woke. The word woke or wokeness or all of these kinds of derivatives, I think has basically just been used over the last year as a slur against anything liberal. So anything liberal is woke. Woke gender ideology, woke racial, identity politics, all these kinds of things. I have no desire to make Christian nationalism the left's version of woke. I
Right.
like it. It should mean something specific. And we have to be careful about that so that people can't say, oh, Christian nationalism has no definition. We'll just make it what we want it to be.
We all saw what happened with our own eyes on January the 6th when a group of citizens stormed the United States Capitol. And in those images, we saw a lot of Christian nationalist symbols, a lot of Christian nationalist language, that was part of the insurrection on January 6th. Sam, we've got a midterm election next week. We've got another presidential election 2 years after that. What do you think is going to happen in the future? I know we're not asking you to look into a crystal ball, but what would happen if Christian nationalism or Christian nationalists prevail? And even if they don't, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, I think it could go a couple of different ways. I think optimistically, we do see a pretty, I think within a short amount of time, we see Americans backing away from the concept. I think we've tried to ask similar questions over years and years of distributing national surveys, and I think there's enough evidence to suggest now that fewer Americans subscribe to just hardcore Christian nationalist views. Most Americans like separation of church and state. Most Americans think that's a good thing. Most Americans do not want theocracy or anything resembling what we describe as Christian nationalism. And I think there's evidence to suggest that fewer Americans do, or within the last, say, 7 years. That is a positive and a negative. So on the positive side, I think there's a shrinking minority of people who actually espouse those views. The bad side of that is that the more that happens, the more that group really recognizes they are a true, persecuted minority. I don't mean persecuted unfairly. I just mean they're a minority.
Sure.
And they become more militant, more radicalized, and more strategic. And that's how you win in politics. It is not the majority of Americans who are deciding things politically. Most Americans are moderates. They're right in the middle, that bell curve. And an axiom in political science is that the middle does not move. Or the moderates do not move. They are not donating to campaigns. They're not getting out there and voting in huge numbers. They're not really active. They're certainly not active on social media, doing all the work. And so what you really need to win is you need a very, very motivated and organized and militant group of people who are sure about their cause. So the small numbers belies the strength of the movement, especially when you have very, very strategic and powerful people in place. So if Christian nationalist leaders, people who are running on this kind of rhetoric. So it doesn't look like Doug Mastriano is going to win in Pennsylvania, but it does look like Kari Lake's going to, and it looks like other Senate seats by Lauren Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene or other people like that are pretty safe. Mm-hmm. And so the more that kind of rhetoric and the more these kinds of leaders find success electorally, the more they have the freedom to reshape the American electorate through gerrymandering, through judicial appointments. In 2024 is going to be a huge year. Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump are cut from the same cloth. And they're both going to use that kind of rhetoric to shore up their base. And the more that they make promises to that base, the more they're going to come through for them. And I think you have some real problems with the possibility of religious liberty, again, that slippery term, being used to cover just about any form of discrimination against religious outgroups or sexual minorities. With the Supreme Court the way it is, I mean, that's just an example of an already secure victory for the right for a generation, that they will continue to deliver favorable decisions for the Christian right. And so, I think there is going to be rough sledding ahead. It looks like right now, I'm looking at the numbers today, it looks like the Republicans are going to take the House and possibly the Senate, likely the Senate. I mean, not by a huge majority, but they probably are going to take it. And so what does that mean going forward? I think, it means that if anybody is opposed to this kind of ideology, this kind of political strategy, and this identity, I think that means there's going to have to be some pretty motivated work on behalf of people who want to fight for democracy.
Well said. Well, I hope that you're right. I hope that there's going to be a mobilization of sensible people and that people get out to vote next week. We have been encouraging all of our listeners to get out and vote next week. No matter how you vote, make sure that you get out and exercise your right, because it is very, very important. Well, Dr. Samuel Perry, he is the author of The Flag and the Cross, and you heard it earlier. He's getting beat by two books that are supportive of Christian nationalism. So go to Amazon right now and buy his book. Let's get his numbers up so that he can overtake those other two. But we really appreciate you being a guest, and you're always welcome back here at Good Faith Weekly, Dr. Perry. But before we let you go, Missy's got one last question for you.
Dr. Perry, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." In light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell? And if you can remember your response from last time, I'll give you a pass and let you use it again.
I cannot remember my response from last time, so I will use a response this time. I think, I think if we can find a common cause with people on the right who are, I think, attractive or persuadable to Christian nationalist rhetoric, it is a question that I think all of us have to answer as citizens. And that is, what unites us as a nation, if it's not religion, or if it's not some kind of common ethnicity, or some kind of common heritage, or even a myth of a common heritage or ancestry. And I think that has to be our commitment to creedal values that Americans have long revered and held to. The things that we find in the Declaration of Independence, that legal equality, that full civic participation in democracy, of equal rights under the law, of representative government. That is a small kind of government, and I don't mean small in the tax sense. I just mean a government that doesn't interfere with our lives. We like that. Those are all things worth defending. Those are things that we feel like make America really great. And so I hope that we can develop common cause with people on the left and the right to say democracy is important, protecting the rights of individual citizens is important, and that means everybody's rights to practice religion how they want to, and that we make society a great place to be, and that doesn't depend on us taking America back for some kind of mythical Christian subculture.
Well said. Dr. Perry, thank you so much. We wish you the very best, and we hope that next week goes without any kind of conflict or violence, and America is at its best next Tuesday as they go to the polls. Missy, what are your thoughts? Hang on, folks. Let me get Missy out of her fetal position and back to her chair in front of the mic.
Right. Nothing against Dr. Perry. He's clearly a brilliant thinker and scholar, and
absolutely,
but I mean, not the most uplifting, topic, I guess. So we have an election just a few days away, which is one of the reasons we decided to kind of camp out in this space a little bit about Christian nationalism and how it is impacting our government and our elections. We feel like it's important to keep educating and getting the word out. It's just our way of doing something. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, because there's been a lot of debate around Christian nationalism. Is it a political movement, as Dr. Perry discussed in the interview? Is it a political movement, or is it a theological movement, or a combination of both? And as someone trained for ministry who has a master's of divinity with biblical languages and a doctorate of ministry degree in religious liberty, I am deeply concerned because I think, yes, it is a political movement based upon the acquisition of power and the sustainability of power, but at the same time, it is infused with theological convictions that have evolved into theological praxis in an attempt to take control of the federal government and subjugate all other citizens who disbelieve in that type or strand of Christian thought. So I am very worried about it. And, as we see these election deniers continue to gain power in the Republican Party, who deny the fact that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election to Joe Biden, just reminds us that they are not above recreating history in order to support their current ideology and grab for power. We heard recently from Governor Rick DeSantis of Florida that, can you imagine, he said, a little white child sitting in class and hearing that his ancestors stole land from the indigenous people? And then he had the audacity to say, that never happened. That's not true. Really, Governor DeSantis? I've got decades and centuries of history from my ancestors who say otherwise. It's just absolutely absurd. But if it was not so dangerous, it would be funny. But Missy, it is extremely dangerous. And there's going to be some of those individuals walking the halls of the U.S. Capitol beginning in 2023.
So as I have gotten older and started to research and read more about how this kind of thinking has become more prevalent, and now it's just more out in the open, just learning about the coded language and the dog whistles and things, and feeling pretty embarrassed about not maybe making those connections, even though some of them were when I was a child. So I don't know what I would have done different. But I want to quote the great prophet Moira Rose.
You might want to tell some of our listeners who may not be Schitt's Creek viewers.
Who doesn't know Moira Rose, you guys? In fact, I may just start bringing a Moira Rose quote every week. I feel like that would
theology. Oh, that would have been a great sermon series. Yeah.
So she says, sometimes the eye won't allow the brain to see things at first. And I feel like as a country, that rings true in a sense that there were so many little things that happened along the way that just, the eye wouldn't allow our brain to see. And so I thought maybe you could take a couple of minutes and we'll just pull a couple of examples from the book that we read of Dr. Perry's, and also I think you're referencing this in your article that came out this week, about two ways in which this language kind of crept into our thinking in our country. One is the dollar bill, in God we trust, and the other is the Pledge of Allegiance when we say one nation under God, which I never knew those were not always there. And I'm guessing many of our listeners probably did, and they're saying, duh right now, and they're going to, shut this off because they've heard the story. Yeah. However, I feel like for maybe some people who don't know this, maybe you could take 3 minutes.
Okay. Set the timer.
Okay. Ready? Go.
Yeah. Well, first of all, In God We Trust was, it replaced our original national motto that was E Pluribus Unum, which meant, it was Latin for out of many, one. And that was the national motto because our founders truly wanted to create a secular government that kept church and state separate. They understood, they were not anti-religious, but they understood that government needed to remain neutral when it came to governing all citizens. And therefore, they put the First Amendment into the U.S. Constitution, which includes the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. People have the right to practice their faith as their conscience dictates. But at the same time, Congress and the federal government should not advance the cause of religion. So, the original motto, out of many, one, was a beautiful expression of this melting pot of the United States in a hope to become one union.
You know, you mentioned the melting pot, and I just remember in elementary school and even on up, being taught in social studies, you know, America was founded as a melting pot, and that's what we were supposed to be. And we learned the story of the Statue of Liberty, and, you know, bring me your, what is it? You're weary. I'm sorry, I don't remember the quote.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the idea that you built up in your mind. But I mean, of course, we were also taught that Thanksgiving was a happy feast between the natives and the pilgrims.
Wait, it wasn't?
So lots of things problematic. However, it's almost just following history that everybody was fine with that melting pot until our, maybe we could say our fragile white male egos got word that they maybe weren't going to be the majority forever. And then, you know, they just look for ways to keep power and whatever that is. And it just, you know, happens to be Christian nationalism obviously is effective and works. But, you know, once they start to lose power, it's like, do we really want to be that melting pot?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, the founders who came up with this, it was a philosophical, ideological move of genius to include this as our motto. But let's also be very clear, they did not practice it, many of them, Jefferson, Madison especially.
Well, it was written for white male landowners.
Right, so they had the power.
They were accidentally genius. Could you say that? I don't know. Maybe.
Maybe. But at any rate, that struggle continued throughout the country. In fact, we had a civil war about it. And in fact, if you do a deep dive of history in the phrase, "In God We Trust," that is actually when that phrase began to emerge as a cry for unity. Now, what's interesting about it, it doesn't come from the South, it comes from the North and the Union soldiers saying, "In God we trust," thinking that Providence was on their side and God was on their side to win this Civil War. Well, anyway, fast forward to 1956. President Eisenhower passes this idea, and I can't remember if it's executive order or a piece of legislation, but a new motto replaced the original, and that new motto was, "In God We Trust." Now, there's a couple of schools of thought why that was. Again, this is 56, the rise of the Soviet Union. The Cold War is rising in tension. And there were preachers like Billy Graham preaching the godless communist and the godless Soviet Union. And therefore, as a communication strategy, it set the United States as God's chosen people versus the godless communist. There's also another undertone to this, that the out of many one was problematic for a lot of folks in the South, because this idea of oneness to the segregated South was never acceptable.
No, I can see that.
So, I mean, it was really just a combination of many ideals and many situations where the Eisenhower administration put "In God We Trust" on our currency and then inserted the phrase "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance.
It's so crazy to me to think about that, because when I first learned that little tidbit, I don't know, it was several years ago, but I remember trying to say in my head the Pledge of Allegiance without it, and it didn't. I mean, it's just so ingrained. We don't even think about it. Now, to someone who is not of our faith or not of a faith, I can see where that would be.
I've told this story many times from the pulpit, that I can remember growing up in the east side of Tulsa, Oklahoma, going to Walter Reed Elementary School, walking into class, walking into homeroom, and every day we stood up for the Pledge of Allegiance, and we would put our hands over our heart and recite the pledge. And to my left, there was a little girl who was a Jehovah's Witness. And because of her faith, she chose not to stand and recite the pledge, nor offer an invocation for school starting. And I can remember little kids making fun of her or poking fun at her because of her religious stance. And it was just so disheartening. And even as a child, I knew that was wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard that story. I still know her name. I know we won't say it out loud on the air, but you've told it so many times. I will never forget her, and I can see her. But you know how that, I think we forget what it's like to be that one. And there are places in the world where you go and you might be that one person who's not included. And that's not what we're about. That's not what we're supposed to be about. We can do better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any others that came up? Any other thoughts came up in our conversation with Dr. Perry?
Oh, yes. I don't know if you caught this, but he did say at one point, and I don't think he realized the genius that he spouted, but I'm going to take this and claim it, because he mentioned in passing, he said, we can do something, and
is that an exact quote?
Yes, that's an exact quote. And we can make America really great. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's it. That's my new slogan, is make America really great. Do you know why?
Why?
What's the acronym?
Oh my gosh, no.
MARG. Y'all, we are going to make America MARG with a salted rim. And it's going to be beautiful.
Beautiful.
It will be beautiful. We can cheers again on that note.
Well, that's great. Well, Dr. Perry was fantastic, and we are sitting here within a week of a midterm election. Lots going on in the country, lots of concern about Election Day, but we just want to encourage everybody out there, please go vote. It does not matter who you're voting for.
But be an informed voter.
Yes, but be an informed voter. Mark Twain, I think it was Mark Twain who said...
I have no idea. you know my quote, bank here is the likes of Moira Rose. So.
Absolutely. I think it was Mark Twain who said, if you want to know why America's in such trouble, all you have to do is have a conversation with an uninformed voter. So,
if he didn't say it, folks can let us know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who actually said it.
Absolutely. But I do have this quote, and this is a good one to end on, Missy. It's from the 16th President of the United States, the great emancipator, President Abraham Lincoln. He summed it up best when he said, "Elections belong to the people. It's their decision. If they decide to turn their back on the fire and burn their behinds, then they will just have to sit on their blisters." Ladies and gentlemen, let's make certain we don't sit on our blisters after Tuesday.
Wow. I hadn't heard that one.
It's a good one.
That's great. Where'd you find that?
Found it on the old Google.
On the Google, so you know it's true, you guys.
No, it was in a book I found. So, well, thank you so much for tuning in this week. Next week, we will, if our democracy is still viable, we will be back with another great guest. And we hope that you have a great weekend. And we'll talk to you next week. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.